here's Lilly. So Lilly, go ahead and share. There you go.
Yeah, I think I'm trying. Is that working?
It's taking a second. There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So hi again. I'm, as Kate mentioned, I'm Lilly Anderson-Messec. Let me just get my notes up here. And I'm the director of North Florida programs for the Florida Native Plant Society, but most of my job is the TorreyaKeepers Project. That's about 75% of my job. And this is a collaborative project that we work with the Atlanta Botanical Garden on, and we work very closely in conjunction with them. And I don't think either of us could have achieved what we have achieved without the collaborative effort that we've put forth, and it's working really well. So starting off, I wanted to just mention a land acknowledgement that the Torreya Taxifolia, the native range of this species, is found on ancestral and unceded lands of the Muskogean Creek and Appalachian people. They, along with their ancestors, have been stewards of this unique region throughout generations. And then also, there are so many organizations and individuals who have contributed immensely to the conservation of Torreya taxifolia, and there are just too many for me to mention in this time given for this presentation. And that this, what I'm talking about today, represents the current work of the TorreyaKeepers Project, which is built upon and in collaboration with the contributions of many organizations and individuals. And we want to give credit and thanks to everyone who has contributed to the accumulated knowledge and protection of this species. So a little bit of background about the TorreyaKeepers Project. It was originally started by FNPS Magnolia chapter members and spearheaded by Lee Brooks, Billy Booth, and Helen Roth, who are all local landowners within the Terea range. And they're also native plant enthusiasts. And they began surveying privately owned land in the area for undocumented trees. And they collaborated with the Atlanta Botanical Garden, who had been working on Terea for a while, along with the University of Florida, Terea State Park, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And then the project was adopted by the state organization of the Florida Native Plant Society in 2019. And that's when I joined. And the TorreyaKeepers Project is currently working very closely with Atlanta Botanical Garden, and Ashlyn Smith, who you saw just back here, she is their Gulf Coast coordinator. She lives in the Panhandle, a little bit further west of here. And she and I work together to survey private and public lands for remaining trees. And we collect data on the trees that we find. We also collect tissue samples for genetic testing and cuttings, which are then grown out at the Atlanta Botanical Garden to preserve the genetic diversity of the tree. And we also collect canker samples of the fusarium that is infecting the tree for research at the University of Florida. And I will go into more of that in a little bit, but first, let's see, oops, too far. Okay, Florida Terea. Terea taxifolia, the individual pictured here with me is one of the most healthy and mature representatives found in its natural range. It is a planted specimen that is at a state park. And I just wanted to go over a few facts. It's in the family Taxaceae, the yew family. And Torreya is a genus of conifers made up of 6 or 7 species within the family Taxaceae, like I mentioned. 4 species are native to Eastern Asia, and there are only 2 native to North America. I was talking with Kate beforehand that she was saying it looked like California in those pictures. And the only other Terea actually occurs in California, and that's Torreya californica. And the genus Terea is named after American botanist John Torrey, who first identified Terea as a new species from the plants here in Florida. They were sent up to John Torrey, who was in New York, by Brian Hardy Kroom, who owned property along the Apalachicola River and was interested in plants. They are medium-sized trees, small to medium size, which means for a tree, they grow max 50 to 60 feet, which is considered still medium-sized. They're evergreen, and I want people to notice, as far as identification, the flat arrangement of the needles on the branches. They are linear, they're pointed at the ends, and they're hard and very prickly. I'm not sure why it's not progressing. Okay. Oh, now it's going too fast. Okay. So on the stem of the plant, on the trunk, they are spirally arranged. You can see here the spiral leaf arrangement, but on the branches, they are arranged flat. And again, they're very hard in texture with a sharp spine. So Torreya can be either monoecious or dioecious, but Torreya taxifolia is dioecious, which means that each individual tree is either male or female. And the male pollen producing cones are grouped in lines along the underside of the branch. You can see there in the top left, whereas the female cones, they create these large, they're very large fruit that are hang from the tips typically. They're nut-like seeds surrounded by a fleshy covering. Sorry, it's not progressing correctly. Huh. Okay, if I can figure out another way to. Let's see if it'll progress now. Okay, so I mentioned all of these things about the features of this species because there are some other species that are commonly misidentified as Torreya, one of which is an equally, if not more rare species within the family Taxaceae called the Florida yew, Taxus floridana. Okay, so from a distance or in photos, Taxus floridana looks almost exactly the same as Torreya, but in case you guys ever get out to Torreya State Park or Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve and get to walk around and want to see these trees, in order to differentiate them, there are a few things you need to know. Obviously, when they're in fruit, you can tell there's a large difference in their fruit. That's a female fruit in the bottom left side of the screen. And this species is also endemic to the ravines along the Apalachicola River. And as I mentioned before, it's possibly even more rare in terms of number of individuals than Torreya taxifolia, but because this species has always been rare and it hasn't had this catastrophic decline that Torreya has, it hasn't garnered quite as much attention. So notice that the needles are shorter with more blunt tips. They're soft. They aren't sharp. And the undertone of the color of the leaves, the new foliage is glaucous for one. And then even from a distance, they tend to have a slightly more bluish hue to them than the more yellowy green of the Torreya. And then if you see them in fruit, you can tell them that it is also dioecious. So they're either male or female Florida yews, and they are on separate plants. So the needles of Taxus are arranged very similarly to Torreya in that they lie flat along the branches here. But again, they're softer and flexible and not sharp. And then here's some differences too in the trunk. If you see a specimen that is mature enough, you can tell a difference in the trunk. The bark of this species are also different. Torreya taxifolia is on the right, whereas the yew is on the left in this little illustration here. So here's the slide just comparing the reproductive structures of those two species. These aren't the same exact species, but they're two two species of a Torreya and a Taxus that are found in California, and they have very similar attributes. So you can see the male and the female. The fruits of the females are very different on the different species. Okay, so when someone calls me and tells me that they have a 50-foot Torreya in their yard, this happens fairly often too. It's most likely that it is this non-native tree that is commonly misidentified as Torreya. It's called Chinese fir, Cunninghamia lanceolata. It's in a different family, Cupraceae. And it's very similar in appearance. The needles are firm and sharp, and they look similar from a distance, but as you get closer, you can see, if I pointed out that flat needle arrangement on the Torreya, you can see how these are spirally arranged, the needles. This species is also monoecious, so both male and female fruiting bodies on the same plant. This is native to Southeast Asia and South Central Asia, and it was brought here by the horticultural industry, and it could actually be the possible introduction of the fungus that is killing Torreya now, that I'll talk about in a little bit. So it's, it's a beautiful tree, but it could be the cause for what's killing Torreya. And it definitely is not Torreya, in case you see a very large tree that looks like a Torreya. It is probably Cunninghamia. Okay, so here's a little comparison of all three in one photo. So you can see how fluffy the Cunninghamia looks as compared to either of the species. You also wouldn't find the Cunninghamia in a ravine, whereas the Taxus and the Terrea are going to be found almost exclusively on the edge of the ravine, on the slope, or down in the ravine. Okay, so back to Torreya. It is endemic to the unique Steephead Ravines along the Apalachicola River in the Florida Panhandle, with a few populations occurring just north over the Georgia line into Georgia. The historic range of Torreya Taxifolia has always been narrow, but it was once a very common component of the wooded Steephead Ravines found in that range. And there were plentiful 30 to 60 foot tall specimens, which were frequently harvested for their durable wood. But they began to decline by about the 1950s. I'm still thinking about moving to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to mention a little bit about the Steephead Ravines that they occur in. This is a illustration from an excellent book, if you're interested, called Priceless Florida, Natural Ecosystems and Native Species. That's a great book if you're interested in the ecosystems of Florida. And it talks about the type of species that you see in these unique ravines. They can vary depending on whether the slope is south facing or north facing, and Torreya are typically found on the north facing slope. And they're unique because they are found on, you only find Steephead Ravines on stranded ancient barrier islands. And rather than the water flow, with the typical ravine, water flows along the surface of the soil and slowly erodes from the top down, which usually creates kind of pointing tips on the ends of the ravines. But Steephead Ravines, because they're are in areas where there are deep sand, there's a layer of deep sand because they're ancient barrier reefs, like we mentioned. The water will percolate down through the sand, and so then it comes out about halfway through the slope of the ravine, and so it erodes from beneath, and the sand from above kind of starts to slope in and gets pulled down and creates these sandy creek bottoms down at the base. And they are always flowing, even when there's low rainwater. And the water tends to be very cool and cold in the ravine, and it creates a unique shape. So these ravines are very deep and very steep. They can be, an 80 feet drop at a 45-degree angle even. And they create their kind of own microclimates that are consistently cooler and shadier. So here are a few species that are found in our Apalachicola River Steephead Ravines. And so the Apalachicola River is around 30 million years old. And some of the plant species found there are even older, including Torreya Taxifolia, because they were already established before Florida even emerged from the sea. And these species established themselves in the Apalachicola River region during glaciation, and as the climate cooled or warmed over time, they were able to persist in these little microclimates in these ravines. And so a lot of the species that are found in the Appalachian Mountains are especially abundant in these ravines, because the Apalachicola River is the only river in Florida that originates from the Blue Ridge Mountains. All the other ones originate from the Gulf Coastal Plain. So a lot of those species were able to move down here through the Apalachicola River, and then they were able to persist in these kind of relictual habitats in the ravines. So moving on, trying to progress my screen. But as I mentioned before, the historic range of Torreya taxifolia has always been narrow, but it was once very common. And by the 1950s, the species was in catastrophic decline. You can see the range right here. It's pretty much, there was one population on the west side of the Apalachicola, but almost all of them now are found on the eastern side of the Apalachicola River, with the exception of planted individuals. And so, because so few of these trees reach maturity now, there is virtually no reproduction in the wild. And so it's considered functionally extinct. And here is a slide about the timeline of important events. In 1938, there was observation of leaf loss on Torreya trees. By 58, dead trees on the high slopes of the ravines were noted. By 62, all canopy-sized trees were dead and only resprouts remained. And in 1984, it was listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And 1986, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Recovery Plan was written for Terraria. In 89, the Atlanta Botanical Garden began their conservation efforts with the species. So they have been working on the species for a long time. And it wasn't until 2011 that the fungal pathogen was actually identified by Dr. Jason Smith at the University of Florida as a novel Fusarium species, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And in March of 2018, TorreyaKeepers was formed as an outgrowth of the Florida Torreya Tree of Life Conference. In 2018, Hurricane Michael hit, which drastically altered the slope forest habitat of Torreya and caused approximately 20% mortality. And as of 2019, just over 700 trees were remaining. ABG and FNPS continued surveying, and it's now considered functionally extinct because there's no sustained reproduction in the wild. And so there are a lot of current conservation actions happening at the moment that I'll go over, some of them in more detail than others. Each is important to the continued survival of the species in the wild and provides, information to help better understand and how to protect the species. So over the years, the reasons for this drastic decline have been very hotly debated. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There are so many theories that have been surmised through habitat, and we do know that habitat degradation from development and silviculture and climate change and other human causes definitely have contributed to its decline. And the trees are also susceptible to rubbing by deer. Deer love to rub on them. But the primary culprit for their decline has been identified as another reason, the Fusarium torreyae. And this is a fungal pathogen that was recently identified and described, like 2011, as I mentioned, by Dr. Jason Smith at UF, and his lab is continuing to research it. I collect canker samples for them and send them over to UF. And Jason suspects that this fungus evolved in Asia, along with relatives of Terea taxifolia, possibly the Cunninghamia that I mentioned earlier. And that it was probably brought here, through the horticultural industry. And when the trees are stressed, the action happens. They become infective. They might not show signs of infection until they're stressed. And then the fungus causes leaf blight and stem cankers. You can see photos of those here. And then what happens is it's similar if you're familiar with laurel wilt or even American chestnut. It dies back to the roots and then resprouts, but because it inevitably becomes stressed again at some point, that resprout will die back again, and it often doesn't reach sexual maturity, those resprouts. So it's, again, we consider it functionally extinct. So all the Torreya trees that have been tested for this fungus have proven to be infected. So even if they don't show signs of disease, it's probable that all of the plant material for this species is infected with this fusarium. And most worryingly, the fusarium, which is likely spread by airborne spores, has been proven to jump and infect other unrelated hardwood species, as well as other rare conifers such as Carolina hemlocks, eastern hemlocks, and pinus species. And so for this reason, it is not recommended to plant Torreya taxifolia outside of its native range to avoid any unforeseen consequences of spreading this fungal pathogen. And so there are some people that want to reintroduce Torreya to the Carolinas because predecessors of Torreya are recorded there in the fossil history, but it's not a good idea, especially considering the pathogen that could cause possible extinctions in other species. So keeping them where they are and trying to protect them where they are and treat the fungus is our main goal. So here's, if you would like to contact him, if you have any questions about the fusarium. I'm not a fusarium expert, but here's his contact info. And he and his colleagues, they were able to isolate it from cankers. And I collect cankers for Jason and his colleagues, and they continue to study this species. And ABG, now that when I say ABG, I mean Atlanta Botanical Garden. I'm just so used to saying that. Now that we know we've identified this fungal pathogen and we've isolated it, we can test whether specific fungicides could help and treat this specific fusarium. I don't know a lot about fusarium, but from what I understand from Jason, they have different mechanisms for to cause cellular death, like that create those cankers. They use different chemicals, and so learning how this fusarium functions, we have to know how it functions in order to treat it best. So just any fungicide might not work, but now ABG will be working on testing different fungicides on this species, and they are already doing that this summer. And so again, another issue that Torreya is dealing with is Hurricane Michael came through, and if you guys haven't been out this way, I mean, it's shocking to see the devastation. It's very, very severe. So it really hit this area head on, and these ravines now are really altered. It's causing erosion issues in the ravines because so many of the trees up in the uplands have died. And then it makes it very difficult, as you can see here in these photos, to survey because we are on these very steep slopes, which are often, loose soil. And we are climbing over and under piles of felled very large trees that could be precariously, stacked up upon each other. And then we're also dealing with the secondary growth of vines and briars covering all of those things. And so trying to navigate these areas and survey these areas effectively is very difficult. It's not easy work. So what we're doing is surveying private property. As I mentioned before, the public property within the Torreya range has been very well surveyed by this point. The private property, there's a lot of privately owned property within the Torreya range, and it has not been surveyed. And so why is it important to survey that property? There are a lot of reasons, but I first wanted to mention just the people that are working on it. I wanted to give recognition to Juliet Renier, who is my boss and who has been wonderful, as well as Ashlyn Smith, who I work with closely, and then her boss, Emily Coffey at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. We couldn't do this without them, and it's been such a wonderful experience collaborating all of us together on this project. We've worked so well together, and I think it's a great example for how other projects could work, if organizations really collaborate effectively without ego. So again, I asked, why would you bother surveying? Well, for one, it is, the government determined. They issued the recovery plan for Torreya Taxifolia in '86, which states that private property should be searched for Torreya trees and cooperation sought from owners to protect trees and allow access for conservation purposes. But there are a lot of other reasons, which is, private property was just as terribly hit by Hurricane Michael. And so, helping out those landowners to figure out how to maintain the land and figure out whether they have Terraria at all is, I think it's really meaningful. But the big reason why, I'm skipping around, oh no, I didn't. Okay, never mind. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Okay. Okay, so private property owners, they didn't see any less damage than Hurricane Michael. They have fewer resources available to restore their properties. They might have an extremely rare plant on their properties. There are a lot of other rare plants that occur in these areas. And a lot of these property owners are actually very interested and excited to find out about that and help out. So okay. This is not the order that I thought I had it in, but I guess we're here now. So again, this is very hard work, and was going to show you guys some videos of our hardworking volunteers.
Hey,
there's Ashlyn and Nicole, and then here is what it looks like on the ground in some of those areas where vines and briars have grown up over these felled trees. It can look literally like a sea of green.
covered.
And in that case, in that spot, we had a location for a tree we were trying to get back to get a DNA sample. And it was underneath all of those vines. We had to get through them. And then it also can get very, very hot. So our volunteers are very hardworking, and I'm so grateful for them. I couldn't get through this without them. Okay, now I can't go to the next. Sorry, this is more difficult than I thought it would be. Okay, here are some volunteers. Okay, so So we collect cuttings from the trees that we find, if they're healthy enough, and those trees are sent to Atlanta Botanical Garden for conservation and ex situ collections. And the cuttings have to be taken during the fall and winter to be transplanted successfully. Man, all of my, there are cuttings. The more genetic diversity represented in ex situ collections, the better chance the species has of survival. And we have surveyed over 600 acres, which is a lot. And we've gone to over 16 privately owned properties, and we've found over 160 trees to add to that very small number of, only about 700 that they knew of. So that's a big deal, and it has really changed, what we know about Torreya, because we previously had 82% of the known population was on public land, and now it's only 66% because of the surveys that we're doing. And so it's really important. There's Ashlyn and I taking cuttings to send. And then the cuttings go to Atlanta Botanical Garden, and they grow them out there. And ex situ collections, they're important because they're a backup of genetic material in case of local extirpation or extinction. And over 500 Torreya trees are represented at the Atlanta Botanical Garden and ex situ collections, Torreya Taxifolia. And these are individuals and not just clones. So that's pretty awesome. And Torreya Taxifolia is represented more than any other Southeast plant species in ex situ collections. And the trees are providing not just a backup of genetic material, but also seed for seed trial for reintroduction. So they are able to, in controlled conditions, they're able to keep the tree's health much better than they are in the wild. The trees are much healthier, and they're able to reach sexual maturity, and then they're able to collect seeds for seed trials back in that natural range of Torreya taxifolia. And so as the number of cuttings increases, the need to store and care for the plants also increases as they mature. And ABG has received funding to not only collect cuttings from trees located on private property, but they also expanded the nursery for their growing collection of trees. And so another component of conservation in rare plants is conservation genomics. This is not my area of expertise, but you all likely know that genetic diversity is strongly associated with the likelihood of a species recovering, and the ability of a species to resist disturbance and the resiliency to recover from it is strongly tied to its genetic diversity. That's why it's so important to have so many trees growing healthily ex situ. Conservation genetics utilizes genetic theory and techniques to reduce the risk of extinction in threatened species. And for Terraria specifically, conservation genetics can be applied to allow us to know how genetically robust the populations are in the wild, as well as how successfully we have been capturing the genetic diversity in the ex situ collections. So to contribute to this work, we have collected DNA samples from every single Torreya tree that we have found. Every tree we find in the wild, we collect samples and we send them to ABG. And so this work is being carried out through a partnership between Atlanta Botanical Gardens and the University of Georgia. And this is a list of their results. Thus far, they're still doing the genetic sequencing on the species. But they are developing a probe set to perform sequence capture on 325 Torreya individuals. And so far, we have been able to contribute to that 325 with like 160. Okay, so another conservation goal is long-term monitoring of the existing plants that are known on public property. And so Emily and Loy at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens have been in charge of that. That's also something we do in the winter every year. We missed last year because of COVID, but 40 trees were affixed with humidity and temperature monitors and annual growth measurements, as well as ecological and habitat assessments will be conducted over the next 10 years to provide information on how these trees respond after the disturbance of Hurricane Michael, which we know that that Hurricane Michael caused at least 20% mortality of Torreya taxifolia of the known populations on public land. And seed trials, as I mentioned before, ABG is growing out their trees and able to collect seed from them. And so we have 9 seed trial locations on both public and private lands. We planted 3 seeds from 7 maternal lines in both caged and uncaged areas at each location. And we're having these seed trials are in order to determine whether planting Torreya taxifolia is actually a feasible method of restoration. And so far it hasn't been, you know, they have not been super successful. They're very slow growing, but we're still collecting data on those every year as well. And so also habitat suitability models, they're becoming more frequently used for rare plant conservation. And the premise behind these models is to utilize the best available occurrence information paired with several environmental variables, including soil information, elevation, climate data, and others to produce a map of potential suitable habitat. And the process to go from inputs to model outputs can vary greatly. And there are many methods and programs available to do this, but the ideal result is a map that can be used to prioritize rare plant searches. So they're kind of predictive modeling. They're trying to figure out where we find these plants, the habitat and variables that we find them with, and then trying to predict on maps where we would likely to also find them. And Nicole Zampieri, she's been a regular volunteer doing Torreya surveys. She's a great friend of mine. She's also a field biologist for FNA and a graduate student at FSU. She did some preliminary modeling for Torreya as part of a class project and has provided her data and files to this ABG intern, Nabil, to refine the model and compare with other model types to get the best results. And they'll be working on this together for soon. And so far, just with Nicole's model, it was very accurate. It was surprisingly accurate. It was really interesting to see how accurate it was. And one of the factors that was heavily correlated with Torreya occurrence was lack of nitrogen in the soil, which was really interesting fact. And then, so that's the entire presentation. I'm sorry about all of the little technical difficulties I've had, but I wanted to first really say we want to acknowledge how wonderful our private landowners have been in allowing us to come on their property. A lot of people are concerned that if they find a rare plant on their property, the government's going to come tell them what to do. But plants don't have the protections that animals do, and it's up to the landowners to protect these plants. And I've been really pleasantly surprised by how many landowners are very interested and very excited to find out about this and how they really want to take part in conservation. And also our survey volunteers. Here's a list of volunteers from just this year. They've been incredible. We couldn't do this work without volunteers, and it's really hard work. It is not easy. It's very difficult. So they really deserve some credit. And then also, of course, this work could not be done without grants from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and individual contributions from FNPS members and supporters and conservationists. That's what pays my salary. So I'm very grateful for them. And yeah, that's it. And I have time for any questions if anybody has any.
Well, thank you very much, Lily. That's interesting. I have to agree that those pictures and the videos make it look like it's seriously hard work to get out there and find these.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of questions in the chat. Adam wants to know, why is it called stinking cedar?
It smells. Yeah, Adam, you planted that tree. You should break some of those needles and smell it. To me, it's a very distinct and strong odor. It smells to me like tomato plants, like the plant part, the leaves of tomatoes, but concentrated. It's a very strong smell. So that's why one of the common names is stinking cedar. And another common name is gopher wood, which I'm not sure how it got that common name. But interestingly, because apparently the Bible talks about Noah's Ark being built from gopher wood, Southern Baptists came to the conclusion that the original Garden of Eden was on the Apalachicola River, because that's where gopher wood grows and it doesn't grow anywhere else in the world. And so there's a portion of Southern Baptists that might still believe that. And that's why the TNC, the Nature Conservancy's property, has the Garden of Eden Trail. Cool. That you can go to see Torreya trees on.
Let me just mention, for those of you who don't know, Ixia recently planted a Terea at Native Park. And so Adam and Lily, before the presentation started, were discussing whether that was a good idea or if potentially that might have introduced that fusarium into our local area. So I'm not sure what the future is of our Torreya at Native Park. Any thoughts? Are we going to dig it up and move it over to Appalachia?
I mean, since it's already there, it's kind of like the damage is kind of done. So you might as well. I think the big thing is just education and letting other people know that there's a reason why it shouldn't be planted. And, but at this point, I think you might as well let it grow.
And, we could produce a nice sign that had information about Torreyas.
I think that would be very useful. I think that's really important too, is, just offering people the correct information.
Yeah, teachable moment.
Yeah.
My question was, how old does a tree have to be reproductively mature and start making pollen or seeds? How many years?
It's probably at least 10 to 15, maybe earlier, depending on conditions, because there are so many conditions. As we all know here, plants, when stressed, can either produce more seed quicker, or they can be slow to produce seed, depending on the species. They're so variable. And so there are, some trees that are of reproductive age and produce flowers. I've never seen a female produce cones in the wild, but I've seen males. There are more males than females in the Torreya population. But yeah, I don't know I think it's just too variable to say for certain. I would say it's between 5 to 10 years.
Does that big old seed or fruiting body, is it there just one seed in there or a bunch?
Yes, just one.
So what eats it?
I don't know that anything eats it now. I mean, something might have eaten it at some point, but they have a lot of those chemicals, like this, that make it smell, is, I'm sure, probably to prevent, herbivory, but I don't think that it needs to be processed through an animal's stomach in order for it to be viable. And in fact, the seeds, one of the interesting distinctions about Torreya taxifolia is that the seeds do not stay viable very long. They have a very short viability compared to most plant species. So yeah, I don't know that anything in particular eats them.
When you say short viability, do you mean a few months or a couple of years?
No, a few years. So, I mean, I think most plants in the right conditions can remain viable for at least 10 years, you know, if not much longer. And, you know, this species in particular does not remain viable long. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that that is a consideration and a hurdle for conservation efforts.
If anyone else has questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask them. We've got a little time and we've got a small group. So if you guys want to unmute, anybody?
Yeah, or if you have any questions about other plants in the ravines too. I was thinking after I spent all this time on this that I should have probably, since we're all plant people here, I probably should have included more photos and interesting info about the other rare species that occur in those ravines, but wanted to get all this information to you.
Well, we can have you back for another talk about the ravines.
Yeah.
How far is it from here? I'm not a Floridian. If we wanted to drive over there for a field trip, honey, how far away is it from Jacksonville?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly. I've always stopped in Gainesville before I go to Jacksonville. I don't.
Couple hours.
And then done another trip. So I would guess that it's at least 3 hours, if not 4, right?
I think you're right. Yeah, Tallahassee's
because Torreya is an hour west of Tallahassee. So, you know,
drive.
Yeah.
Mark wanted to know, could you hold that book up again and tell the name of it?
This is a great book. Priceless Florida. And it's by Pineapple Press, puts it out. I know Jack Rudlow and Bruce Means are big contributors to this book. There's just a whole lot. There are a bunch of rare, you know, amphibians and reptiles in this area too. There's all kinds of rare flora and fauna. And so Bruce Means has done a lot of work in these Steephead Ravines, and one of the ravines is even named after him. So yeah, that's a great book. I definitely recommend that.
It's a big, thick, I've got a copy. It's a big, thick, heavy book. Lots
of
information.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I think Oscar's got a question. He's not quite sure what to say or how to phrase it.
But if anybody wanted to see, you know, Terea or you, and especially just to see the ravines, it's really an experience to come out here and see, because until I went out there, I never would have guessed that Florida could look like this. It looks like the Appalachian Mountains, and as I mentioned, you know, the Apalachicola River is the only river in Florida with headwaters in the Blue Ridge Mountains, as opposed to the coastal plain. So the Torreya State Park has a lot of trails, and then the Nature Conservancy has a lot of land called the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, which is just south of the Torreya State Park, and they have a great trail as well called the Garden of Eden Trail, like I mentioned. And it's really great to be able to see the different, I mean, you go from these upland sandhill bluffs in the Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, where it's longleaf pine and, you know, eriogonum and conradina and clinopodium and all these kind of dry, sandy, opuntia, you know, sandy plants. And then you have this weird ecotone in between the bluffs and the ravines. And then you go down into the ravines and a steep drop. And it's pretty spectacular. You don't get to see an 80-foot drop in a lot of places in Florida. And then you're in this lush, moist, cool habitat that has Florida anise and you know, Stewardia, the silky camellia, and Silene catesbii, all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't typically think of seeing here. That wild ginger grows out there, all kinds of cool little, like, you know, Appalachian type plants. Kalmia, the mountain laurel, is all along those streams when it blooms in the spring. It's unbelievable. So it's, yeah, it's really neat to get to see that. And then you go back up on these trails, you go up and over the ravines, and then you get into these big bluffs that overlook the Apalachicola River, which is quite a sight. And it's been historically, you know, it's been populated for a very long time with various indigenous peoples have been living along the Apalachicola for a very long time. So there's a long history of human habitation in the area, which is really interesting. And not a lot of that is recorded, but there's a lot of archaeology that happens in that area because of it.
Yeah, that area is definitely on my list to visit. So
Yeah, well, let me know if you're coming.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. We definitely will.
Any other questions?
I was just thinking about the private landowners, and you know, my thought was like you, that private landowners wouldn't really want to be surveyed. But when those pictures you showed of the ravines, that's not really an area that a private landowner is going to be developing.
Yeah,
It's not
they
some
don't.
place where you're going to be farming or building houses.
Yeah.
So
a lot of the private landowners that we deal with are timber companies, and they are planting pines in the uplands, in the sandhills, and they don't go into the ravines. So it doesn't really affect them. And it looks good for them, you know, to be working with a conservation organization and collaborating, and it doesn't really negatively affect them in any way because it's not going to get in the way of their planting. And we do recommend they have a buffer between the edge of the ravine, ideally a 300-foot buffer between the edge of the ravine and where they begin planting pines to prevent erosion and infiltration of invasive species into the ravine. But yeah, I've been surprised. I mean, I've definitely had a lot of people who were not, you know, not interested in talking to me, but a lot of people have just been so excited to hear about it and kind of are thrilled to have a rare plant on their property. And, you know, we are very conscientious about working with our private landowners. We don't share their names or their locations or anything. We're very quiet about it because we want to protect their privacy. And, you know, ultimately we are guests on their property. And so, you know, whatever they choose, you know, whatever they decide I can and can't do on their property is, you know, we have to abide by. So, you know, I try to stay gracious and appreciative. And I really have just been, I've had great experiences with people who just become way more interested in native plants because they found a Torreya tree on their property. And they might not have even, some of them hadn't even learned much about plants before. And then they start going to Native Plant Society meetings because they have a Torreya tree.
that's pretty cool. Jessica wants to know, what's the best time of the year to visit the ravines?
I mean, fall and winter is really beautiful because there are lots of American beech that are out there, and they have beautiful fall color. It's gorgeous to see the beech out there changing color. And then there are also a lot of native maples that change color out there. But spring, like May, April, is a great time because a lot of those rare natives start blooming, like ash magnolia is blooming, and the fringe campion, Silene Catesbii, and the Indian pink, the Spigelia marylandica, all kinds of cool stuff blooms in spring out there. And definitely stuff that you don't see anywhere else in Florida except for these areas. So that's a great time to go. And you can camp out at Torreya State Park. And, you know, as I mentioned, these ravines kind of create their own microclimate. It's often cooler out there than it is in the other areas of Florida, or even up in the sandhills above the ravines. And there are some primitive campgrounds at Torreya State Park. I think they're back open again. And they're just look over the ravines that are, it's just really nice camping spots. I mean, they were pretty destroyed, you know, they look very different than they did before Hurricane Michael, but they're coming back. And with the open canopy, a lot of the herbaceous species have responded with bouquet blooms, you know, like tons of flowers in spring because they suddenly have a lot more sun. So there's also rhododendron astrinum and rhododendron canescens that bloom in spring, like April, May. And so and the kalmia, the mountain laurel, is about May. It's really lovely.
Well, looks like that's it for the questions. So I just want to say again, thank you, Lily. Interesting talk, interesting tree. Really reminds me of the California redwoods, but
Yeah.
not that fruit. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your enthusiasm. And I will go ahead and say goodbye to everybody. And thank you for coming. And
Thanks,
we will
Lily.
see you
It was an awesome
hopefully next
presentation.
month.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. See you guys.
All right. Bye.
Bye.